Welcome everybody to the South Asia Initiative at the Asia-Pacific Research Centre at Stanford. It seems a little bit strange to be talking about South Asia today and to be talking about anything other than the immense suffering and desperation that we see with the latest wave of the pandemic in India. So to everyone listening, if you are in India or if you have friends and family in India, I hope you find strength and courage that you need. I hope your loved ones, importantly, find the care that they need. And most of all, I hope that you do everything to stay safe. Today, we are discussing something that seems quite far removed from that, but may not be, the strategic competition in the Bay of Bengal. This is something we here at the South Asia Initiative have touched on in several of our past events. We've spoken about the India-China security competition. We've spoken about the Indian Ocean in an off-the-record event. And we've spoken about transnational policy challenges in the Bay. And today, in today's event, we bring those threads together. Our aim is to understand why the Bay of Bengal matters from a strategic standpoint, what challenges are posed by China in the Bay of Bengal, and what responses India, along with its like-minded partners, may be able to mount to those challenges. To do that, we have two of my favorite people, two of the smartest and most accomplished scholars of the region, and maritime affairs in the region in particular. You can read their full bios on the event's website, but let me quickly introduce them. First, we have Professor Siraj Mohan, who is the director of the Institute of South Asian Studies at NUS, the National University of Singapore. As you know, he's one of the keenest observers of Indian policy and strategy generally, and a proponent of a strong and active India. Among his many books, he's written one on strategic competition in the Indian Ocean called Samudra Manthan, and he writes a regular column for the Indian Express. We also have Nilanthi Samaranayake, who is the director of the Strategy and Policy Analysis Program at CNA, the institution formerly known as the Centre for Naval Analyses. She is also, I think, one of the finest analysts of strategic dynamics and especially US policy and strategy in the Indian Ocean region. So Raja and Nilanthi, welcome. Let's begin, as I promised, by talking about why the Bay of Bengal matters, why it matters today and why indeed it's mattered historically. From the perspective of the India-China strategic competition in the region, maybe I can ask you, Raja, to begin with why the Bay of Bengal may be a particularly consequential sub-region of the wider region, and perhaps the way to tease that out is by sort of understanding its historical evolution to date, why, how current trends are leading to the situation we have today.
I think over the last many decades, certainly after the post-Second World War period, I think much of the Indian Ocean and including the Bay of Bengal, largely went out of the kind of strategic map because one reason for that was both India, China, Burma, which are the main flanking countries on the littoral, all turned economically inward. And India pulled out of the global strategic politics in the region by saying, look, we don't do security politics, we do non-alignment and that kind of thing. So the region actually fell off the map in a sense, and the great power competition moved to Central Europe as well as Northeast Asia. The rest of the, Southeast Asia became hot later, but the Bay of Bengal, the Indian Ocean largely became marginal. But if you just step back to the Second World War, you'll see there was another rising power in Asia. Japan came in, occupied, came through Malaya, occupied Burma, and much of the great battles of the Second World War, of course, Americans are familiar with the island hopping, but there was this massive push to get the Japanese out of Burma. And I think 1 million Indian soldiers, which included support from Americans. General Stilwell built a road from India to China to supply the Chinese. So what were we doing in the Second World War in the so-called Burma, China, India theater? Americans were supporting the British Indian Army to help give resources to the Chinese nationalist government in Chongqing, and all getting together to push the Japanese out at some points in hand-to-hand combat out of Burma. And 1 million Indian soldiers were out there. So the cast of characters is still the same. It is Japan, China, India, US. And if you take away Britain and put US there, I mean, I think you have a renewed contestation. A new power has risen in Asia. It is coming into the Indian Ocean. And the first stop is the Bay of Bengal. So I think you're going to see a lot of that. But if we step back a little more to the early colonial age, this is the place where all the East India companies of Britain, Dutch, all the others had a great contestation in the Bay of Bengal for the Spice Islands to capture the connections between the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. So I think it dates back to that period. But once the British established the hegemony, then there was really, it became a lake, Indian Ocean as a whole, and Bay of Bengal was even a tranquil backwater it became. But today I think it's coming back as China rises and enters the Indian Ocean through Bay of Bengal.
That's really good, and it's important to understand that this is not something new. But you mentioned something that actually sounded interesting, and that does, I think, apply to today when you said that the Bay of Bengal is for countries who seek to enter the Indian Ocean region. It's the first stop. It's the first place that they would encounter. So maybe, Nilanthi, if I can ask you to sort of zoom out from the Bay of Bengal, if we talk about the Bay of Bengal being important, why is it important for the wider Indo-Pacific region? Is it because it is the entry point for powers east of Malacca entering the Indian Ocean region? Is there something more to it? Why does the Bay of Bengal matter for the wider region, and in particular, therefore, also for the US?
I think Raja's perspective is really useful to think about situating the Bay of Bengal into historical context and to see essentially the continuity of major powers and their interests in the region. I think in the contemporary context, at least from a US strategy perspective, the Bay of Bengal, it's really one of the major maritime basins along the long littoral of the Indo-Pacific. I think that the Bay of Bengal, it's arguably an esoteric prism for viewing the region. I think in the US, policymakers would just look at the countries themselves and think about them in less of at least that explicit maritime context. I think they would think more in terms of these are the South Asian countries to focus on, these are the Southeast Asian countries to focus on. But there has been an increasingly maritime prism for viewing the region. And I would say that's more in terms of the Indian Ocean. So I think the Bay of Bengal is perhaps a little on the esoteric side, at least from standing within the US. But I think for US policy, stability is important just generally, so globally. So the Bay of Bengal, stability in the Bay of Bengal is important, but I think really the US, there's been a difficult relationship, or at least impression, with regard to the Bay of Bengal. Certainly it's seen as the soft underbelly of India. There's a lot of historical baggage, like the 1971 Enterprise incident, which still is often invoked, even recently. But even fast forward to the questions about whether a multilateral Malabar would take place in the Bay of Bengal after the Modi administration came in, because really after that controversial 2007 Malabar exercise, there was this really an aversion to permitting a multilateral Malabar. So I think it was like 2015 is when it actually started back up. So I think from a US perspective, it's really seen as a sensitive region for India.
That's really interesting, because and tell me if I'm trying to make something of this that doesn't actually exist, because I am convinced of the importance of the Bay of Bengal as a sort of coherent geographic unit. Obviously, in our mental maps, as you said, we divide it between South Asia and Southeast Asia usually. But so is this something that people generally, I'm detecting from what you're saying that this is something that generally people don't consider as a coherent geographic unit, and that they sort of therefore approach it differently, incoherently almost.
I think it depends where you sit, because in India, I think we've certainly seen a renewed effort to really focus on the maritime domain in general, the Bay of Bengal, regional institutions like BIMSTEC. So I think from an Indian context, it makes a lot of sense. I'm really just speaking, in Washington, D.C. area, thinking about it from a U.S. perspective in terms of priorities, where the South China Sea is a maritime basin in the region that gets far more attention, for example. Even the Arabian Sea, actually, as well. So I think the Bay of Bengal is still a bit esoteric comparatively.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's what I was getting at. I was talking about from a US perspective, that it seems to be almost peripheral in the strategic imagination of people in Washington.
I mean, just comment on that, Arzan. I mean, just because the US doesn't see it, it doesn't mean the object does not exist. I mean, so I think part of the mental problems have been the division of the world into regions after the Second World War, but really in a particular context. And for example, the term Southeast Asia was first used when the British set up the Southeast Asia Command to push the Japanese out of Eastern Indian Ocean, including in I like to always remind people where the headquarters of the Southeast Asia Command was. It was in Sri Lanka, a place called Kandy, right in the heart of the mountains of Sri Lanka. So I think it tells you something that these divisions were constructed. They were not, there was no Southeast Asia, there was no South Asia. There was the subcontinent, there was East Indies, if you will. There was Indochina, there was Nippon, there was Cathay. Now, the constructions that were made for convenience become then obstacles for seeing the region. So I think going back to the question you asked, I mean, you can think of South China Sea as everyone knows is the central part, but you can think of the Bay of Bengal as the antechamber, as Robert Kaplan said, to the South China Sea. All these sea lines of communication connecting the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean come out towards the Bay of Bengal, the Malacca, Sunda, Lombok. So the region is going to become, these waters are going to become important. And I think within Bay of Bengal, there is a subzone. You can call it the Andaman Sea. The Andaman Islands divided, it flanks the Thai Isthmus, brings together the two regions. And I think that is where the contestation is going to begin, because you're going to see a whole lot of new projects out there. And that's where the monitoring, the surveillance, a whole lot of things are going to already beginning to happen. And I think my sense is that one way or another, America, I think, is going to begin to talk about it. I think they talk about the first fleet, sometimes presented as the Eastern Indian Ocean. So I think the region is going to become important. And as the Chinese keep pushing the US Navy a bit further, so would you like to get out of the first island chain? Then I think the Americans will begin to see the other options that are going to be looked at to deal with the expansion of the Chinese power. And I'll just conclude with one thought here. Unlike the Japanese who came in, occupied Burma, Andaman Islands, the Chinese are a neighbor of Burma to the north. That is, they're a natural desire to run down Burma into the Bay of Bengal. And as China rises, so it's going to come both from the sea as well as from the land. We already have the pipeline from Burma to the Bay of Bengal. There's talk about Chinese bases. I mean, some of that is speculation, but it's a natural way for China to come down into the Indian Ocean, besides coming through the Malacca Straits. It's useful to recall Deng Xiaoping, when he took charge, one of the first trips he made abroad was to Burma. So it was all Burma was the back door to China, or you can say for China, it is a front door into the Indian Ocean. So I think it's going to be an exciting and very interesting place to watch in the days ahead.
Can I add to this? This is a really fascinating discussion about essentially how regions are framed and created, if you will. I mean, even there was this discussion in the 70s about the creation of the Indian Ocean region. So they really are socially constructed. I would say, definitely agree, Raja, that that's just what the U.S. says. I mean, it's really an extra regional conception, I think, of the Indian Ocean, really looking outside in. And I would say for the U.S. perspective, as an analyst, else, it's been fascinating observing the shift in the articulation of US interests in the region, because the US really talked about its interest being in the Asia Pacific. And then gradually it started to understand the importance of the relationship with India, and then started talking about the Indo-Asia Pacific. And then gradually that morphed into the Indo-Pacific. I'm talking about what US policymakers and strategy documents say. So I think the US U.S. thinking right now, I think it's starting to think a lot more about the Indian Ocean. Hopefully, we'll get there where we're actually thinking specifically about the Bay of Bengal. But I'm detecting that shift from the Asia Pacific to the Indo-Pacific now, thinking about the Indian Ocean, the sea lanes. So hopefully that we'll get a lot more granular in terms of the focus on the particular maritime basin.
Yeah, indeed. And it's interesting you mentioned that, because the Australian defence establishment has started to recognise the Bay of Bengal. They don't call it that. They have a much less evocative label, the Northeast Indian Ocean, but it essentially amounts to the Bay of Bengal. And in the latest Defence Strategic Update last year, it listed the Northeast Indian Ocean as being part of Australia's primary zone of strategic interest, basically extending from there through archipelagic Southeast Asia into the Southwest Pacific. So I think there is a very nascent acknowledgement of this as a zone of particular contestation, as you mentioned, Raja, and that's what I want to turn to now when we talk about contestation now in the Bay of Bengal. What are we talking about? Are we talking about essentially a competition for advantage in terms of traditional, conventional military posture? Or are we talking also about non-traditional security issues? Of course, we're talking about both, but where is the weighting especially when we think of military planners and decision makers in New Delhi? In their minds, do they see the Bay of Bengal as being a zone primarily where they need to get conventional military posture right, or as a zone of risk that needs to be managed, especially for sort of non-traditional issues?
I'm not a specialist on non-traditional security issues, but I think it is there, and I think that applies to all the oceans, and ocean health, the ocean monitoring, securing the environment. I mean, those are big issues, and I think every part of the global waters get covered in that. And some of that figures in the debate today, whether you talk about blue economy, sustainable growth, securing the coastal communities, all those issues are quite central. I mean, I think they're far more central in one way to the economic development, to the sustainability of the region. But I think my focus, is really on what's new is really that this was largely tranquil. As I said, look, British defeated the French, and you had the Indian Ocean became a British lake. And then, after the Second World War, you saw a revival of this region. And then it went back because really the contestation shifted elsewhere. Today, I think like all the European powers came into the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean. Today, China is coming from the east. And I think China's need for resources, China's need for economic reliability in Africa, in the Middle East, brings it naturally. It has stakes in the Indian Ocean. And my sense is it is going to protect them through greater naval presence, perhaps bases. Now, the recent reports last few days of the Djibouti base being upgraded to host an aircraft carrier. So it's not, I'm not saying it's good or bad. I think like all great trading nations, China is going to build a big navy. It is building a big navy. It's going to show up in the Indian Ocean. Right now, it is not on a permanent presence, but it will eventually get to a permanent presence. So it's cultivating special relationships, political, building a lot of civilian ports, creating a military diplomacy. And eventually, I think it wants to be an actor. And I think that right to be an actor, it can't be questioned. The question is, what does India do? What does US do? That is the question. I think that's where the contestation begins. The Chinese frame it as if India, US are going to get together to squeeze the trade through Malacca for China. India And US say, look, China is expanding into the Indian Ocean. This is going to make it worse for the region. So I think the makings of a contestation are natural as a new power comes into this ocean space, and the US is stretched out. So US is building new coalitions. The Quad is one of them, and India, which generally refused to join these kind of coalitions, is joining those. I mean, if you can cut out all the pretense, I mean, it's really about the rise of China and dealing with the Chinese power. So I think we're at the beginning of that stage, and I think this is going to be a long process. And as I said, because of the geographic location of the Bay of Bengal, that you're going to see a lot more of that. And the Chinese submarines today operate close to the Andaman Islands, owned by India. India is trying to work a lot of diplomacy in the region, work with the littoral states to monitor. India, Japan are talking about getting a better maritime domain awareness, or shall we say simpler maritime intelligence, to deal with what China is up to. So I think we are at the beginning of a great contestation, which is going to go on for a long time.
So I want to come back to this, and we'll talk in some more depth about this idea of the nature of what China is doing, and in particular, to put you on notice, I want to pick up this idea of China's growth into the Indian Ocean being not inherently good or bad. But I want to see from the Indian perspective and perhaps from the US perspective, what are the risks involved. But before we do that, I do want to just, Nilanthi, ask you, when Raja also just mentioned the Quad. Now that's a good symbol of, as he said, a grouping that is designed, when you strip away the pretense, to counterbalance China's influence. However, the way it does business, the activities that it actually engages in, are also heavily focused on what we would call non-traditional security issues, right? So the big announceable was vaccine diplomacy or vaccine assistance. It puts a lot of emphasis on HADR operations. We hear a lot of talk about the risks of climate change in the Bay of Bengal. So I want to ask you, just to close out this issue of the nature of the strategic competition in the region, how do you see the balance or the interplay between these sort of conventional jostling for influence and position versus almost the instrumental use of non-traditional security issues by these big countries?
I think analytically, it's useful to differentiate traditional security from non-traditional security issues. But I think in the Bay of Bengal, it's really hard to, excuse me, to disentangle them, because non-traditional security can have traditional security effects and consequences. You mentioned the COVID and the vaccine diplomacy. Before that, it was the mask diplomacy. Also, this Quad Plus grouping that the US started under the Trump administration after when COVID first really hit. But taking it back, even thinking about the tsunami when it struck. I know, Arzan, you've written about this. Striking Bay of Bengal countries, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, but you saw this non-traditional security crisis strike the region. And then as a result, you saw India, the US, Japan, Australia coordinate operationally on the provision of disaster relief, coordinate and deconflict from each other. But from that, we saw a traditional security outcome from that non-traditional security event with the emergence of the Quad and certainly the rise of it in the last several years. I think even back to the MH370 search and locate mission and some of the strategic competition that we saw in terms of between India and China and the Bay of Bengal and the search in the region. So again, it's a non-traditional security event and crisis, but there is that traditional security dimension to it, and particularly in the Bay of Bengal. So I think it's a bit hard to disentangle, but it is analytically very useful to identify the two strains.
Is that something, though, that matters to the local littoral countries of the Bay of Bengal? I mean, obviously, we're talking from the perspective of the big countries in and around the region, the US, India, China, right? But if you were sitting in Dhaka or Yangon, then, I mean, surely you've got more pressing concerns than which country can exercise sea control 300 miles from your coast, right?
Absolutely. The small states, they really, and smaller states, I would include Bangladesh in that. It's definitely not on the size and capability of India, for that matter. Yes, they have national development goals that they're trying to meet. Their economies have been ravaged from COVID. So certainly this layer of competition strategically between the US, China, India, that adds a layer of complication to the already difficult challenges that they're trying to overcome as smaller states in the region.
So let's come back to this issue of the thing that is new, which is China's growing presence in the region. Raj, if I can press you on this issue. Of course, analytically, we understand that a rapidly growing country and military seeks to extend and protect its expanding interests. But if you're sitting in Beijing, if you're sitting in New Delhi, or in New Delhi's partner countries like Washington, and you see an increasing tempo of Chinese naval deployments through the Malacca Strait, you see a very rapidly growing PLA Navy, and you see, as you said, the other developments of expanding Chinese interests and presence in the region. What is the risk for these countries? Why is the Chinese presence in the region more inimical to Indian interests than, say, the US presence or the Australian presence or any other presence?
I think you could argue, historically, when India has seen so many great powers and great power navies come into the Indian Ocean and gone. So why is the Chinese, I think, different? Because partly we have a problem with China in the Great Himalayas. And that rivalry, that contestation is going to expand into the waters of the Indian Ocean today. Because today, as China comes in, India's sense of its sphere of influence, or as a primary actor in the Indian Ocean, is going to be squeezed now by the presence of the Chinese. To some extent, it's already happened in South Asia. You mentioned about the small countries. I mean, the smaller countries and small countries, of course, have a natural tendency to seek greater autonomy from India because India is just next door and looms large. Just as the Southeast Asian countries tried to seek some autonomy from China. So that attempt at balancing against India. Today, China steps in and says, look, I can help you do that even better. I'll supply you submarines. I'll supply you weapons. I'll do the training of all your troops. So I think, you go into the nature of India's relationship with its neighbors is going to get a lot worse once the Chinese military comes in, and now it starts establishing bases, facilities in the region. So the kind of pressure that China can then bring to bear on India would be even more, besides the growing economic gap, etc. That I would say is the main thing. And the second is, and that's the reason why India is building a coalition today. Coalition building was not part of its strategy, but today it works with the Americans and the Japanese and the Australians to monitor the Navy movements. There is greater exchange of information and to compete. That Sri Lanka and Nilanthi can tell you. I mean, I think the contestation for ports in Sri Lanka, the contestation for influence everywhere else is going to grow because India, having ceded once to the Western powers, I mean, that is a great, a colonial argument that outside powers begin to dominate and squeeze your space. So I think it is today has some capabilities, and it can't act alone. So that's why it works with the distant power US and Japan and Australia to find ways of balancing China. Because if you don't do that, then the costs for India politically, diplomatically, and strategically is going to get a lot worse. And I think that is the assessment, at least in Delhi. So the question is no longer, is Delhi reacting? It is reacting. Is it effective? Is it enough? I mean, those are the big questions.
When you talk about the costs for India of this sort of sense of squeezing, it's a very sort of evocative term, but in really sort of material, tangible terms, what are we talking about? Are we talking about a reduction in the Indian military's ability to operate? Are we talking about limits on India's economic prospects in the region? Are we talking about a reduction in or a deterioration in India's political relationships with these countries? What is it that is sort of tangibly at risk here?
If you recall, the US got really crazy when the Russians tried to set up a base in Cuba, right? Now you had the World War almost upon us. So the India has seen China-Pakistan relationship grow. There is a whole range of strategic cooperation between them. Tomorrow, if the Gwadar or Karachi port become a base for China, that is a threat. I mean, I don't see it's a self-evident threat that you have actually the beginnings of an integration of the Chinese Navy and the Pakistan Navy. China is building the 4P frigates in Karachi. So if you have actually a hostile neighbor gets even deeply connected to militarily, and so far there was no naval dimension to China-Pakistan relationship. It's going to be out there. Second, I think Nilanthi is from Sri Lanka. But if you say, look, the Chinese Navy begins to send submarines, nuclear submarines. It happened a few years ago. And then the nature of the relationship between China and Sri Lanka, which is India's fear, and you could say it might not happen, that it becomes very different from the one today. So that again will cut space. For example, if you see the last few years, the Chinese have got all the projects they wanted, and India can't get any project done today after offering all kinds of things. And Japan can't get it. I don't know, Mr. Adani will succeed where the government of India could not. We will see that. But the fact is, the space for economic activity and the threat from expanding military activity are going to be a reality. And I think historically, when post-World War, India said, look, China is not a threat. China is great. When Americans said China PRC doesn't exist, India said, no, please take them into the UN Security Council. They're very important. In the 90s, again, we sat with the Chinese and said, unipolar world is a bigger problem. But today, as Chinese power radiates at us across the subcontinent from the waters of South Asia, India's position vis-a-vis China has fundamentally changed, both territorially in squeeze in the north, and if China gets bases, facilities, or a permanent presence in the Indian Ocean, it has consequences. It's one thing for the Americans. I rely on the Americans to secure the sea lines of communication from the Gulf to India. Is another to let the Chinese get their hand on the spigot from the Gulf.
This is good. We're getting really into the nitty gritty here. So we understand now what interests are at stake. But Nilanthi, can I press you? Can I ask you to take that one step further? And if we're sitting either in DC or New Delhi or any of these like-minded partner countries, what types of Chinese activities are we most concerned about? So Raja mentioned the prospect of new bases, right? Obviously, that is something that, as he said, is self-evidently troubling. Are there particular specific activities or operational activities that China may undertake that are particularly troubling? Has anyone actually thought of that, or is it still in a very sort of vague, sort of teeth-gnashing kind of sense of, okay, anything that China does is worrisome? Or is there more a sense, and Josh White has written about this, is there a sort of a granularity, a fidelity on what actually is threatening?
It's a good question. I think right now we're really at that phase where any Chinese activity is alarming, gets a lot of attention. So whether it's a commercial port activity, even port visits by naval vessels, I think there needs to be there is a recognition now that China is here to stay in the Indian Ocean. I think there was a lot of, sort of grief and sort of bargaining, if you will. How is this happening? Why is this happening? And now there's more acceptance that China is here to stay in the Indian Ocean. But I think that next step, though, is being able to separate the signal from the noise. Essentially, China is going to be in a lot of places economically, militarily, diplomatically, but what are the true pressure points? Where should India, where should the US really focus its attention? Because China is going to sail its aircraft carrier eventually someday into the Indian Ocean. But so it's what are really the activities that the Quad countries especially should really be targeting?
and along similar lines, Raja, is in Delhi, for example, is there a sense not only of what activities should be of priority concern, but is there a sense in New Delhi that the Bay of Bengal matters more than other sub-regions in terms of the India-China competition? Has there developed a sense that, you know what, there is a priority and the Bay of Bengal is the antechamber to the South China Sea, and this should be first and foremost the urgent need?
No, just to step back a minute, I mean, I think the US scholarship has been so obsessed with the India-Pakistan nuclear equation. They've not paid attention to the rest of the region, the politics, the geopolitics of the rest of the region, and the stability instability paradox, which has taken lives of so many scholars and so many man years and woman years. But if you see the rest of the region, I mean, China has been a major supplier of submarines to the region. China has, its arms supplies today. Would love to sell the JF-17 to Sri Lanka. Bangladesh has Chinese submarines. Thailand, which is supposed to be American ally, has Chinese submarines. So you're seeing already, these are maybe not great submarines. You can dismiss them today, but at some point there'll be better submarines. And you have submarines means you need to communicate with them. You need to create facilities. You need to create, and for example, the Chinese today would love to expand. They're expanding the military diplomacy. Tomorrow, Chinese will say, look, it's a simple economic activity. If Americans come and drill in the POC Strait, I mean, which is between India and Sri Lanka, for an oil field, I mean, nobody's going to lose sleep in India. But if it is China that does it, so it's not just, so what China is doing it. After all, this is economic activity. Because the Chinese nature of the Chinese state today is what the problem is. But that was an abstract problem limited to the Himalayas or to the distant parts of the Asia. But today, the character of the Chinese state, its expansionism, that is a political driver. If as I said, look, if Norway comes and drills, I mean, Norway wants to mediate between Sinhalese and the Tamils. Okay, I mean, some eyebrows get raised, but nobody's going to run for cover. But if the Chinese are going to do it tomorrow, that they do things in Burma today, which they did not do before, they might do things in Pakistan tomorrow. So I think you're going to see a Chinese geopolitical ambition. I'm not questioning the right to be ambitious, but I have to take the necessary steps to deal with it. I presume for 70 years, Chinese are harmless. They're nice people. They're fellow Asians. We are Asian brothers dealing with the wretched West. But now we find that the problem for India or for the region comes from the Chinese power. Now, I can see the smaller states have actually interesting options. I mean, they have better balancing options between US, India, and China. So they're going to be more attractive in terms, that's the reason why there's so much wooing of some of these countries that is beginning to take place. But it's also a delicate dance that the smaller countries have to do. That is, when you're balancing against a giant next door, it pays up to a point, but after some time it could get too complicated. I mean, since you're all in the US, Ukraine is a big issue. You can see how much of NATO do you get into Ukraine, and when do you provoke Russia, and when do you bargain with Russia? So those issues are there as well. But I think every speck in South Asia, the smaller countries, and in the Indian Ocean are going to be important part of the geopolitical contestation. Seychelles, Mauritius, Madagascar, Sri Lanka, Cocos Islands. So if a new power is coming, it needs access. So the island territories become important. So I think this is going to be a contestation. Is not just whether China is just another great trading nation. So we all thought China will be like Switzerland, just interested in counting their money. After all, they have other interests, obviously. And I think as those become clear, I think people are going to take action now to deal with the potential. Possibly someday we can do a deal with the Chinese. But at this point, if you don't respond, if you don't balance, the major countries have no option to down the road.
So let me ask you both, Nilanthi, and please address that as well. But also, if you don't mind, answer this big question. India, as we've said, feels that it has to do something to manage this. How does India achieve its objectives? How does India secure its interests in an environment where it sees those interests being progressively squeezed by the increasing heft of China in the region? What is the Indian, to use the jargon, theory of success or theory of victory in how it conducts or what it seeks to do in this competition?
Well, I think one way of getting at it is really what Raja mentioned, the smaller states in the region. I think so far we've really looked at the outcomes of what the smaller states are doing when it comes to China. But I think we haven't yet dug deeper in terms of what the individual drivers are behind why are these countries working with China. Why is Bangladesh pursuing submarines or pursued submarines with China, Thailand, Raja mentioned? What is driving these countries? I think it really calls for a deeper understanding of small states, foreign policy, calculus, and decision-making. I think only then can India and other Quad countries really get at strategies to counter this trend where China provided essentially really cheap submarines that Bangladesh could afford. And what does that suggest then? More capacity building, or are Quad countries willing to do that? We've seen capacity building, really bilateral capacity building efforts from Quad countries. Australia giving the Bay class patrol boats to Sri Lanka, Japan giving Coast Guard boats to Sri Lanka, US giving Coast Guard cutters to Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. We've seen these bilateral efforts, and India, of course, is a major provider of capacity to the entire Indian Ocean region. But we haven't really seen, or it's not apparent at least, really coordinated capacity building between the Quad countries. So I think that potentially is one way of getting at this phenomenon that we're seeing, is essentially to study what the drivers are behind each of these states, these smaller states' decisions to acquire certain platforms, and then think about what can the Quad countries do as a coordinated, coherent strategy to counter that phenomenon that we're seeing.
This really gets to the term we use as competition, and as a few people have remarked regarding the US-China competition, we use the word competition. It is a competition over something. And indeed usually over other countries. And so it seems like what you're saying is that in order to succeed in this competition, a great power needs to listen and understand what it is that the objects of that competition seek, and to tailor policies accordingly. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, absolutely. It's a competition over a few things. Certainly, allies and partners. That's one dimension of the objects, as you say. But there's also just the sheer bilateral nature of the competition, whether it's Russia hacking into U.S. government systems. So there's that element to it as well. So I think it's, and then there's just also the competition for the rules of the road. We talk about the rules-based international order, and very different from what China's doing in the South China Sea, for example. So I think it's a competition over a few sets of strategic issues where really Quad countries have very differing viewpoints than China does.
Yeah, absolutely, and forgive me, I was being deliberately sort of contracting my language deliberately. Obviously, these countries are not just objects, but I fear that is how they are often seen among great power competitors. And in fact, we've received a question, which is an interesting question, about the extent to which these smaller countries' own security contestations with other smaller countries in the region may play into this great power versus great power competition. So we saw this happen, for example, in Afghanistan, where a local tribe, which had a long-running feud with a neighboring local clan, would instrumentally use the insurgency/counterinsurgency framing to pursue their own very local agenda. Do we see any of that happening in the Bay of Bengal, where smaller countries may exploit or seek to exploit this environment of contestation to further their own local security interests?
For the smaller countries, there is agency. I mean, and I think people will, every country, I mean, even Maldives, which is so small, uses the agency it has vis-a-vis India, China, and the US. So I think that is in the logic of international system as a whole. And I think the problem is going to be that countries like US and India in the subcontinent is messed up into the internal affairs of its neighbors. I mean, it's not that it is doing it deliberately, but the structure, the history of the region. India is involved with the Tamil question, one way or another, which makes it harder for India to deal with Sri Lanka and other issues. While China says, look, we are non-interventionist. We don't do the nonsense that India does in your internal affairs. Similarly, in Bangladesh. So I think India has a specific historic set of problems because subcontinent is so interconnected. And the US has a similar problem. So come and do you come to Thailand where there's a military is running the show today, violating the democracy? Are you going to preach your ally virtues of democracy? Or are you going to say, look, China is a real problem. I'm going to come back now, deal with Thailand, Philippines on a different basis. So I think US is going to have some big decisions to make, that you can't have everything from democracy to coalition. That's what happened in the Cold War, that you put democracy back when you needed to deal with the Soviet Union. But at this point, it looks like US wants to do everything, and that complicates America's options. And finally, within each country, as you said about tribes, there are competing factions which mobilize different major powers. We've seen that happen in Maldives, where you can say, look, so-and-so party is pro-India, so-and-so party is pro-China or pro-US. So that's again, I think it's again, actors have agency and they're going to mobilize whatever they can for their own contestation for power. So it's going to be all levels, great power level, regional level, and internal level is going to be, and I think there was a nice article in the War on the Rocks recently about how the proxy wars between major powers are going to increase because there are constraints on actually conventional wars that we saw in the Cold War. And I think that's probably a repetition is likely today between US, China, and India in this part of the world.
One caveat I would add to that when we're talking about smaller states and their calculus is, I think the level of capability matters. Yes, small states have agency and they have interests, just like the great powers do. But I also think certain small states don't have a level of capability in order to achieve strategic effects, essentially, where you can see like the Scandinavian small states, they're at a certain level of economic development and just in terms of societal stability and structure that is far different from the Southeast Asian smaller states. And then I think you can contrast it to the South Asian smaller states. So I think that level of capability is something that I don't think we've really wrapped our heads around when we're talking. I think we're still at the level of talking about the Bay of Bengal states, the smaller states, as playing India or China off each other. I think we need to go a little bit deeper in terms of understanding what their drivers are in terms of their strategic calculus, but also trying to get a sense of what exactly is their level of capability versus what their national interests are.
So let me turn back to to India and India's options as it sort of pursues this competition. And let me, in the few minutes that we have remaining, I want to discuss the policy options that India has, the instruments of national power that India could deploy as it pursues this competition. I want to talk, just to sort of signpost this, so your subconsciousness can think about it. I want to talk about multilateral institutions. I want to talk about partnerships with others like the Quad, the US, Australia, etc. And I want to talk about actual military activity and military posture. Okay, so let's first talk about multilateral institutions. I mean, obviously and famously, institutions like SAARC and BIMSTEC have been problematic. There is something of a renewed emphasis on BIMSTEC, I think, in recent years. How much stock does India put in these multilateral established institutions? And to what extent is this the way or through these institutions that India can and should wage this competition?
I think all of the above. India has to do all of the above. I mean, say SARC has become dysfunctional because Pakistan is not willing to cooperate with India on any basis until its political conditions are met. I'm not blaming them, but I'm saying that is their position. So India is trying to explore BIMSTEC, but BIMSTEC too is more than 20 years old, is a long way to go into actually achieving something. Then there is IORA, which started in the 90s, Indian Ocean Rim Association, which India is again trying to do stuff. But there are limits to what you can do through these institutions. Most of them end up as talk shops, even ASEAN, which has been there for so long. I mean, you need a dressing, I mean, to take everyone along, the multilateral institutions. But then it's really the new plurilateralism, I mean, terrible word, or you want to call minilateralism. And the Quad is one example, what India, Japan, Australia probably is another. So these are going to be far more consequential because actually small number of states with reasonable capabilities are trying to do things is where I think we're going to see a lot more. And I think India's power differential with China has grown, India can't sell the kind of arms China does because it doesn't have the domestic capacity. Someday it might have, right now it does not. It does not have the kind of resources to put in civilian, military dual-use infrastructure. So it has to work with Japan. So I think there you're beginning to see attempt at coordinating between the two. I mean, it's not effective. It's not a big difference between acting alone and coordinating with other powers. But nevertheless, we're seeing some minilateralism. I've just picked up a new word yesterday, reading American think tanks. It's called microlateralism. Richard Fontaine has talked about working with small states. I mean, you've got to work with small states. And I think we've seen India step up. It had a historically strong relationship with Mauritius, but it never paid the strategic attention. It saw it as a diasporic nation rather than a location which is of historic strategic significance. India saw, probably Delhi saw, Sri Lanka through Tamil question, but today it sees it through the maritime lens. So I think the way India thinks about these countries has changed. It is offering more military assistance. Is looking for military facilities, turnaround facilities across the Indian Ocean. So all the things which we used to abuse or criticize the great powers of doing, we are beginning to do some of that because I think that's inherent in the circumstance that India finds itself. So we are at least a lot less hypocritical than we were before, but nevertheless, so at all levels, unilateral military diplomacy, coordinated microlateralism, minilateralism, and as a top on the dressing as the multilateralism. So all options have to be pursued because the scale of the Chinese challenge is so enormous.
Nilanthi, if you could address that issue, but also, and Raj has already introduced this issue of the minilaterals and the sort of ad hoc partnerships. It does seem, doesn't it, like there is more scope for a great power's interests to be served through these more nimble, more flexible new arrangements than through the old established ones. Am I wrong in judging that?
The minilateral institutions, or not institutions, but just the minilateral groupings, just as you said, they are more nimble. You can get things done. They don't require consensus accord in order to do anything like some of the other institutions do. I'm listening to the discussion. I'm struck by, I think a lot of times, at least in the Bay of Bengal, there's sort of an envy looking at the advancement of the regional architecture just neighboring in the Pacific in Southeast Asian countries, which are also sometimes derided as talk shops. But I think there's a delta there in terms of how much more advanced the neighbors just across the strait are. But that said, I think that it's still a positive development in terms of the development of some of these multilateral institutions, like Raja mentioned, IORA, IONS as well, the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium. You talked about military activities. It was actually when Bangladesh was chair of IONS a few years back, where the institution actually saw its first ever at-sea exercise, a search and rescue exercise in the Bay of Bengal. So still there's a lot of a long road to go in terms of the development of these institutions, but there are these glimmers of what they can potentially achieve just with some effort and really some momentum behind each of the chairs. So I think that that potential is certainly there. And you know, actually, I was also thinking in addition to BIMSTEC, we're talking about the Bay of Bengal here, there's also BBIN. We shouldn't forget about Nepal and Bhutan, even though they are not a Bay of Bengal littoral countries, they still very much have stakes in the Bay of Bengal in terms of access to some of the ports like Kolkata or Chittagong. So BBIN, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, that's another important one of these smaller institutions in terms of helping to advance overall connectivity, which the region desperately needs, I think.
If we are talking about these mini-laterals, let me be a little bit more pointed and ask, again, if you're sitting in New Delhi and you have over the last few years, but especially over the past, say, 12 months or so, really invested a lot of political capital in getting the Quad to become more and more senior level and more serious. What is it that India seeks from the Quad? Or, I mean, not necessarily the Quad per se, but its partnerships with the US, Australia, and Japan. What is it that India thinks it will gain by investing political capital in this and potentially hurting the feelings of a billion Chinese? Raja?
Chinese feelings are easily hurt. I mean, so are Indian feelings are easily hurt. I mean, that takes us nowhere in analytically. But the point is, look, till recently, India was not even interested in the Quad. So the problem was the US, Japan, Australia were saying, look, let's do quadrilateral, Malabar, 4 of us. Let's do Quad. Let's meet 2+2, all of us. Let's do more things. Let's have a secretariat. Is India saying, no, India is the shy one saying, no, a little bit at a time. Maybe it's only in the last 1 year that India has actually convened it, strengthened this process, which it began in 2017 at the official level. So India has been going very slow. So it's not that India is not the demander in the Quad process. It is really the US is saying, let's do more. And India is saying, no, slowly, let's not rush into this, because it still has to deal with the question. How does it offend the Chinese sensibilities? I mean, that not what Global Times says, that am I going to provoke China to do even more on the Himalayan border, where we don't even agree on the length of the border. We say it's 3,600 kilometers. They think it is about 2,000. So that tells you the state of the play on the Himalayan border and the Chinese military modernization. So India has to deal with that problem. So therefore, it has been going slow. But it needs, I think, on the maritime space, it needs more collaboration with the US. And I think the fact that it is opened up to more activity in the Quad in the last 1 year and opened up to more defense cooperation bilaterally with the US, those are two clear signals. It needs help. It needs to ready to work with others to deal with the question of balancing China. So I think, India is just getting there. So India is not seeking anything at this point. I mean, that it will be just exploring this to see what all we can do bilaterally. In fact, the US will be the most important actor for us. A lot of it is going to be done bilaterally. We signed all the agreements, the so-called foundational agreements. There are more purchases from the US. If you saw the crisis in Ladakh, all the top-line American aircraft were flying there, and the helicopters and the aircraft. So I think there is a systematic expansion of the Indo-US relationship. How we play the Quad, I think I think India should do more with that, because its long-term objectives are in building that coalition. And I think we'll see how quickly the Biden administration has come and supported it. So you're going to see progress on that, but it's not going to be like, India is not going to be a Britain to the United States. India is not a Japan to the United States. India is not even a France to the United States. So there's going to be a different way we have to construct this relationship. And the terms of how we work together are going to be painfully negotiated. And there is enough public, at the slightest provocation, you have people jumping up and down in Delhi, like you saw in the FONOPS in the Indian Ocean, though I thought it was a storm in the teacup. But I think this is built. I mean, it has moved quite further than anybody else. So the core of this is still India-US bilateral relationship. The Quad is addressing, and India will do things on its own with Japan, with Australia, with other partners in the region, so that it is not totally dependent on the United States. So the Quad will work, trilaterals will be good, and as well as the other forms of regional cooperation. So going outward from a bilateral India-US, while at the same time engaging China We've never stopped engaging China despite the difficulty. So I think India will manage this situation on its own complicated terms.
Nilanthi, can I pose the same question to you? And I'm conscious of time, and I want to get to the last section on military issues in a second, but just to round out this issue, can I pose that same question to you in a slightly different way, which is that if you were a policymaker in Washington, what is it that you could offer India that would that you think would serve both countries' interests, and in particular in the Bay of Bengal? Is there any sort of is there any thought being given to what types of material or political assistance or joint activity would serve both countries' interests in this particular region, or are we still sort of not there yet?
I don't envy U.S. policymakers and what they have to come up with in terms of actionable options there, but I think really we haven't yet seen coordination when it comes to development finance, like really effectively. I think the US really in the 2017 National Security Strategy talked about the need to modernize the US's tools in this area. And we've seen the stand up of the Development Finance Corporation, but we still haven't really seen fruit of that yet, just even nationally from a US perspective. So I think a potential way forward would be to combine forces essentially with India, because as we've discussed here, the strategic and defense relationship between the US and India is just soaring. And really, it just is the result of almost 20 years of hard effort by both Indian and US policymakers to advance the relationship. So I think what the areas that actually call for more attention and improvement are in areas like development finance, where again, it's important to think about what is driving the smaller states. And really, when you look in terms of their economic development, their middle income countries, lower middle income countries, looking at their debt to GDP ratios, they do need that development finance, and they see essentially infrastructure and connectivity is really their ticket to improving their economies and connecting to regional and global trading networks. So I think some more creative thinking between the US and India on that, and perhaps how to get Quad countries, like Australia and Japan involved too. But I think that would be a fruitful area of really focusing bilaterally.
That's a really good suggestion, and we should make sure that people hear that. I think that's a great idea. Let me turn finally to the issue of sort of hard military power and activities in the Bay of Bengal specifically. There is, I think, a general acceptance or understanding that overly militarizing the competition is perhaps not a good idea for many reasons, including the fact that it may wind up being self-defeating. But the flip side of that, and we've alluded to this when we talk about hurting the feelings of a billion Chinese, is that at the same time, India and its partners need not be overly sensitive to not provoking China. There is still a need to build deterrence and to build, indeed, the warfighting capability should it come to that. So the question I have is for both of you, again, generally perhaps, but specifically in the Bay of Bengal, is India doing enough to build the deterrence required to deter what may be inimical Chinese activities in the Bay of Bengal? So, we see PLA Navy intrusions into India's EEZs, survey ships, etc. Is India posturing itself for the long-term prospect of increased Chinese military activity in the region? Raja and then Nilanthi.
Look, I think, India's problem has been the geography was so favorable to India in the Indian Ocean, and that unlike China, which has to come out of the first island chain, constrained by the presence of the US Navy for the last 70 odd years, India had a free run. But the problem was India squandered that advantage when it had a free run, that it thought, look, China was a friend. We thought that, look, we don't need to do all this stuff. We can be happily online. We can be friends with everyone. So the Indian investment in the maritime domain did not really take place until, 2 decades ago, where it's really began to step up as India opened up its economy. It's beginning to do things. So now I think Delhi is far more awake to the dangers. So in a sense, fundamentally the geographic advantages remain for India, the Andaman Islands, that it really was completely neglected. When you compare to the history of the Hainan Island, how the Chinese transformed it in the last, 20 years ago. India is now finally getting its act together and saying, look, we got to do something in Andaman Islands. We need to strengthen our military presence, that it need not be an outpost that we treat as closed. It could be a permanent aircraft carrier, located on the mouth of the Malacca Straits. So I think the way we think about our natural assets that already exist has changed. And then we're beginning to invest in more maritime capabilities. But there, the problem of resource distribution, Navy still doesn't get enough resources because you have the problem in the Himalayas and with Pakistan. Therefore, the Army continues to get the lion's share, the Navy doesn't get. So now India has to think of a more innovative strategies. And coalition building is one of those. That's exactly why. If India could build its own Navy like the Chinese and a big 500 ship Navy like the Americans or 600 ship Navy, I mean, then we don't need anybody. We can do it ourselves. But at this point, India needs partners because the deterrence requires greater capability, greater coalition building. And I think that's what we're beginning to see, that both at the military level as well as at the political and strategic level. The need to build deterrence, I think you put it rightly, but it's going to be a long haul, and constraints are there in terms of its resources. But I think within that, it is beginning to act. And I think that's why the partnership with the US and the Quad becomes even more important.
And both Nilanthi and Raja, actually, an addendum to that question. You referenced the difficult problem India has balancing its maritime interests with the threat in the Himalayan border. And we've received a question on this as well. I've actually got a paper that should be published any day now on this very topic. But my question is, in the shadow of the Ladakh crisis, do we think that India will redouble its efforts and resource allocation to addressing continental threats and therefore prejudicing its maritime interests in the Bay of Bengal? Or arguably, there is also a case to be made that in fact it's woken up New Delhi to the sort of comprehensive threat posed by China and the adversarial relationship with China, which intrinsically includes a maritime element as well. So how do we see the effect of Ladakh in India's military posture, especially in the Bay of Bengal? Nilanthi and then Raja, if you don't mind as well.
Sure. A few points come to mind. I think, first of all, with regard to Ladakh, it's been fascinating to see essentially how, even though there has been certainly a momentum in U.S.-India bilateral strategic and defense relations forward, this crisis with China in Ladakh, it's been really a catalyst or a driver to push India even closer, with regard to Quad activities. So I think that has certainly helped that effort, especially if you're Indian Navy. I look forward to reading your paper and learning your insights, but there has been this discussion about India's traditional sea blindness and what the Indian maritime services have had to do and cope with as a result. But that said, I think the Indian Navy has certainly been quite nimble and effective in terms of essentially, we're talking about non-traditional security threats with traditional security outcomes. You think about the Mumbai attacks and essentially the mandate that the Indian Navy take the lead on enhancing India's coastal security and maritime domain awareness, and then the creation of the IMAC Center. And that's really had a really more of a traditional security outcome now, a decade later, essentially, with the stand-up of the Information Fusion Center in India, and thinking more about the long-term threat with regard to China, even though that emerged out of a terrorist crisis. And so I think the Indian Navy, Indian Maritime Services have certainly expanded their maritime domain awareness. It started with coastal security. It spread wider. We've seen the Indian Navy Navy undertake its mission-based deployments program. So the Indian Navy is operating in all areas of the Indian Ocean regularly, including the Bay of Bengal. But certainly the Indian Navy is not resourced as it could be compared to the other services. And there still are some jointness challenges that remain in the military. But still though, I am struck by, just even in the last 2 years, we're talking about what can the US and India do together, just seeing the fact that the US and Indian militaries were conducting anti-submarine warfare exercises off Diego Garcia a couple years ago, to most recently seeing US Navy P-8 flights refueling in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. I mean, that seemed like such a reach for those types of outcomes ever to happen, but they're here now, and I think China, Ladakh has certainly been a driver toward that. So we've just seen a lot of movement, certainly in recent years, with regard to US-India military ties and advances.
I too look forward to reading your paper. I mean, I think the pressure on the Himalayas, and I think we've seen this happen. 2013 there was a military crisis. 2014. 2017 and now 2020. So the Chinese pressure is going to continue. And I think that is taking place at a time when India's overall defense budget has not grown. And within that, the Navy's share is going to be less. And then more resources have to be diverted to the actual confrontation that took place last summer. So I think all these are constraints. And I think India, but still will have to do something. And we've seen some attempted, defense reforms, attempts at, strengthening the assets like the island assets. And now we're seeing a debate on aircraft carriers versus submarines. That finally, if does India build, when it had a relaxed environment, it could think of building a Navy that was, all round capable. But today there is a strong argument that, look, it should build nuclear submarines probably eventually to deal with the Chinese challenge rather than building more aircraft carriers. So I think there are, the circumstances force people to think China has woken us up, but the constraints are real. And within that, I think India will have to innovate. And my sense is the submarine arm is going to become quite important. And the nuclear dimension of it, I think will, there's reports last few days, India might order building at least three nuclear attack submarines, which would make a huge difference. I hope someday the US might be willing to share the technology with India, but right now we're not betting on the US, maybe France, but I think ideas there are certainly welcome in terms of what India can do with a nuclear submarine fleet.
I promised that we would address some issues of why the Bay matters and what is happening in terms of competition. I think Raja and Nilanthi, you have admirably fulfilled my promise. Thank you very much. There is clearly more activity in the Bay of Bengal happening right now and in the imminent future than there has been recently. More interests are engaged, both of great powers and of local countries. There is a ton of uncertainty about what China may do and what it means for India. And I think one of the salient points that we should close with is the fact that this is, despite being a strategic competition, it's not just about military activity. In fact, the military dimension is a relatively minor one. So with that, I thank you, Nilanthi and Raja, and hope to see you again soon.